I heard Jamie speak. I heard Jamie speak in a method similar to this. I watched him on a computer, and he gave a similar talk to this about just before the election of our current election. I think back in when Biden was elected instead of the other man. But I found him to be a fascinating speaker, and I immediately wanted to get him for HASP, which I am pleasure. This has been a pleasure to know that he has been able to join us today. James R. Skillen is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and the Director of Calvin's Ecosystem Preserve and Native Gardens. He received an undergraduate degree in environmental science from Wheaton College, a Master of Arts in Theology from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and a PhD in Natural Resources from Cornell University. He teaches courses in environmental studies at Calvin University, including field courses in the American West. He's also written a book, but I'll talk about that when I introduce him next week. So Jamie, go for it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's a privilege to be with you today in the first of two sessions. A couple of things I'll note. My father is also named James Skillen, and he does political theology and political philosophy. So it's possible you came to hear the wrong James Skillen, and I apologize for that, but I hope you'll still stick around. My broad topic, which is quite broad, God, guns, and patriotism, for me is a matter of research interest. It's also a matter of, I think, profound practical importance as we look ahead to the midterm elections next year. There are big questions that we have to wrestle with. How do we think and talk about political identity? How does Christian identity relate to politics, to political power, and to political violence? And how do we promote civil discourse across such deep and, in the United States, increasingly binary divide in politics, where we have different information streams, we talk in echo chambers, and there aren't a lot of cross-cutting opportunities that would really encourage, I think, bipartisan kind of conversation right now. So let me share my screen. Here we go. All right. Can you see that? Excellent. So it's with those questions in the background that I'll take this topic up. My less than radical argument in these two sessions is that Christian faith has been conflated in some circles with potentially violent nationalism. Not always, that's why I say potentially violent. And within this version of American civil religion, I'll say more about that, what's fascinating to me and disturbing are the ways in which the Bible or the cross, some symbol of Christianity, guns, and the nation's flag have all become almost a single integrated symbol of American identity. So my task in the next couple of weeks here. Uh-oh. Sorry, there we go.
It just advanced to slide 2. You're good.
Good. So my task in the next today and next week is to explain how that conflation has evolved and how it's radicalized over the last 40 years. And I'll do that in two parts. Today, I'm going to talk about American civil religion. So this conflation of Christian faith and nationalism. And then next week, I'll talk about why I think for a number of Christians in the United States, American civil religion increasingly justifies extreme rhetoric and in some cases action. Today, also, I'm talking in two parts. First, I want to illustrate the problem. And I put up here on the screen why I'm interested. I thought the easiest way to illustrate this is to talk to you about what got me interested in these questions. I am not an expert in religion and politics overall. And so I come at this question from a particular position. And then in the second part, I'll explain or define the problem as I see it, as it's evolved over the last half century. So there we go. So I came to this topic unwittingly. After all, I teach environmental studies, and I write primarily environmental and political history about federal lands in the West. My first book, you see on the left, is a political history of the Bureau of Land Management, a Western agency. The second book in the middle is analysis of ecology and law in federal land management. As a quick aside, I dedicated that book to my kids. And when I showed my teenage son the dedication page, he looked at me and said, "Hey, Pops, do you think your next book could be, I don't know, interesting?" I assured him it couldn't be. So I kept working. But my point is, my prior writing is hardly a natural springboard to be reflecting on American civil religion or Christian nationalism. And I started the most recent book there on the right, This Land is My Land, thinking I was working in the same research trajectory. I set out to try to understand the issues involved in conflicts over federal lands in the West. And almost immediately, I realized I couldn't make sense of those conflicts without grappling with some significant religion and politics issues, particularly how conservative evangelical Christians and Mormons over the last 40 years were engaging in these questions. So how did I come to that realization? Well, I conceived of the project. Well, I'm frozen again. There we go. I conceived of the project in 2014 when self-proclaimed militias flocked to a town of Bunkerville in Nevada. Some saying they were prepared to kill federal law enforcement agents over a few hundred cows. Cliven Bundy, the man you see on the left, had been grazing his cattle on federal lands illegally for over 20 years. And he had become increasingly belligerent, explaining he didn't recognize the federal government as even existing in his state, and pledging to do, quote, whatever it took to keep his cattle on federal lands. When the federal agencies involved began to take his cattle, he called for, quote, a range war, and hundreds of heavily armed supporters rushed to his side, some promising bloodshed. It led to a tense week-long standoff, and the federal government actually backed down. It pulled out, and Cliven Bundy today is still grazing his cattle illegally on federal land. In the middle of that, I received a call from a British journalist who started the conversation this way. He just asked, "Is this really happening?" And I appreciated his incredulity. If you are in the UK, this idea that land claims are unsettled, that a sheriff's posse can sort of hold off the federal government, probably seemed odd. You know what? I'm sorry, y'all. I think my slides aren't advancing. So what I'm going to do is let me restart the sharing and let's see here. And I will share just the slide view that I see. Sorry, I'll just take 1 minute. And while I'm pulling this up, I'll say, yes, I do measure the quality of my years in the number of times I get to the West. And this year has been a particularly fruitful year with multiple trips to the Sierra Nevada in California. All right, so let me try this again and see if those slides won't freeze up if I do it this way. All right, So there's the British reporter's question, is this really happening? I explained to him the legal issues involved in Bundy's case, which are themselves interesting, but there was a deeper curiosity in the journalist's question and also for me. First, one of the most striking things was how throughout this conflict, Bundy's followers often clothed their potentially violent actions in Christian piety. The press conferences that the Bundy family held each day were sort of one part political rally, one part religious revival. The Bundys are devout Mormons. And members of the family would lead the crowd in prayer, the Pledge of Allegiance, and a mix of religious and patriotic songs. And second, what was even more interesting is that the support Bundy received nationally did not come so much from people in Nevada. It certainly didn't come from other ranchers. The public support he received was coming from people like Sean Hannity on Fox News, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, and self-described Christian patriots from around the country. And militia members themselves, who came from as far away as New Hampshire, did not appear to be interested in public lands grazing. Most of them were talking about defending the US Constitution and defending God's law over and against a corrupt and tyrannical government. They espoused what columnist George Will once called constitutional anti-governmentalism. They celebrated Bundy as a sort of patriotic everyman, standing up for Christian faith, for individual freedom, and the US Constitution. How, both the reporter and I were wondering, was illegal cattle grazing somehow a reflection of Christian character and patriotism? So I started to dig more into this, trying to understand that. And I started reading both a lot that Bundy had written, but also reading what others were writing about him. And I'll share just a couple quick quotes. In one self-published book about Cliven Bundy, it was written by one of his cellmate when he was in prison after this event. The author explained his support this way. The author wrote, "As an evangelical Christian, I relate to Cliven's deep faith-based convictions. For my faith too has a long history of persecution, suffering, and martyrdom, where men and women have given their lives for their faith in Jesus. I'm honored to be part of that heritage of the saints as I follow Jesus." For him, Cliven Bundy was a persecuted believer who shouldn't be protected under the law, but from it. Another supporter who wrote a book about this series of events described Cliven Bundy and his family this way, suggesting that they embody all that is wholesome in America. She wrote, quote, "This is an innocent and loving family, trusting, truthful, honest, and God-fearing. They follow the patriarch and honor and respect their women. They are real cowboys of the West who would work hard and expect nothing less from their children and grandchildren and those around them. They have compassion and love for everyone." So the more I read and followed, the more I think I started to see how Bundy had become or was becoming a powerful symbol in right-wing media. People like Glenn Beck, who had a show on Fox News from 2009 to 2011. People like Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, Tucker Carlson. They had all built their shows on a lament that somehow their America or their viewers' America had been taken away from them by progressives who wanted to destroy the family, destroy the free market economy, and destroy religious freedom. So for them, Bundy had all of these pieces wrapped up neatly. He was a symbol of conservative America that they had been saying was under attack by an overreaching government that liberals controlled. To be more specific, Bundy was and is a white, male, patriarchal, heterosexual, God-fearing, Constitution-loving, hardworking cowboy. And so he very quickly came to symbolize this older America. There's a sort of nostalgia for the cowboy. And the visuals of armed federal agents over and against Cliven Bundy sort of added, I think, a real powerful narrative to this notion that conservative America was under attack. As a side note, his national support dropped very quickly after the event, not because of changes in his constitutional views, but because at one press conference, he said the following about big government social welfare programs. He said, quote, "I want to tell you one more thing I know about the Negro. Because of government subsidy, they abort their young children, they put their young men in jail because they've never learned how to pick cotton. And I've often wondered, are they better off as slaves picking cotton and having a family life and doing things, or are they better off under government subsidy? They didn't get no more freedom, they got less freedom." And while I think some of that same messaging is certainly implied in areas of right-wing media, saying it so explicitly was too much. And so there was a fairly rapid distancing, at least of people like Sean Hannity and Rand Paul. After that standoff, Cliven Bundy hit the right-wing speaking circuit, explaining to people how they too could stand up to the oppressive federal government. And two of Cliven Bundy's sons, Ammon and Ryan, whom you see here on the left, started traveling in the West looking for a new battleground where they could further what they kept calling a new political revolution. And in January 2016, they led an armed occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in southeastern Oregon. They pledged to remain at the refuge headquarters until the federal government gave all of its land to the states or the counties. Now, I want you to listen to what Ammon Bundy said in an emotional YouTube post as he was rallying people to this occupation. He's not just putting this in sort of political terms. This is certainly not about just policies. He said to viewers, quote, "I began to understand how the Lord felt about this country, and I clearly understood that the Lord was not pleased. And if it was not corrected, would be a type and a shadow of what would happen to the rest of the people in this country." He went on to say that his army was there to, quote, "create a defense for the people of Harney County so that they could get rid of the tyranny and chains that are upon him, and that they could follow, as he was following, the wisdom of the Lord." Ammon Bundy drew militia members who waved American flags, Gadsden flags, pocket constitution, crosses, waved Bibles, and guns, lots of guns. He drew unarmed supporters as well. There was a family gospel group who came to sing for the occupiers. There were people dressed up as British redcoats and King George, framing the occupation as another American revolution against tyranny. There were Mormons, evangelical Christians, religious agnostics. I like to think, if this reference means anything to you, it looked like a cowboy version of Burning Man. And as one freelance writer, Leah Sotilli, put it, quote, "If this was the revolution was weird." But you can't have that many armed, angry people in one place without some real risk of violence. And a Western reporter who went and visited the occupation wrote this after spending a couple days there. He said, "It was clear to me that somebody would die. Such certitude as these men and women possess demands blood sacrifice to justify itself. There were too many armed people in and circling the occupation, with too many varying levels of sanity and too many varying motives to be there. Guns, for as long as we have had them, have given undue impetus to arguments that lack merit or reason, given credence to delusional rants." And a little more than 3 weeks into the occupation, Oregon State Police and the FBI, in attempting to arrest occupation leaders, shot and killed one of them, Lavoy Finicum. It was these two events that really sort of shaped my question about, what I had thought was just going to be writing about public lands and trying to understand what is kind of swirled together in these politics, in this question of political identity. Now, from 2014 to 2016, I think in retrospect, I shouldn't have just been focusing on these land issues. I should have been looking more broadly around the country. Because in many ways, had I been paying attention, I would have seen how the same rhetoric and the same constitutional anti-governmentalism, the same sort of resentment was driving Donald Trump's presidential campaign, and importantly, drawing overwhelming evangelical support. After all, Trump too positioned himself as the anti-governmental candidate. He too lamented that the liberal government, particularly the liberal deep state, was bullying Christians, whites, heterosexuals, economic nationalists, and the alt-right. If elected president, he promised, he would break the shackles of government tyranny and restore cultural hegemony for white Christian conservatives. I didn't pay enough attention until Trump won the presidential election with roughly 85% of the evangelical vote. How? His campaign rhetoric was often narcissistic, nationalistic, racist, misogynistic, or just plain vicious. He demonstrated little evidence of Christian faith himself, and he was hardly a model of family values for the right. So how? How did he win the evangelical vote? Listening to that, I heard a number of different explanations. The most perplexing to me were Christians like former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, who insisted on multiple occasions that Trump was the most biblical president in American history. And unless she was comparing him to corrupt kings of Israel, I just wasn't seeing it. Others, like Franklin Graham, presented Trump as a David figure. He was flawed but repentant, therefore chosen by God to lead the nation. To me, what sounded most plausible were people like Jerry Falwell Jr. or a Baptist pastor, Robert Jeffress, who basically just made virtues of Trump's flaws, character flaws. Jeffress, the Baptist pastor, explained that he didn't want a president who was like Jesus. He wanted, and I quote him, the meanest son of a you-know-what he could find in the White House. He at least saw Trump as a Cyrus figure, referring to the Persian emperor in the Old Testament who liberated the Israelites from Babylonian captivity, and who the prophet Isaiah said had been anointed by God for that work. In other words, people like Jeffress saw Trump as God's anointed servant who is liberating Christians from the captivity, in an increasingly liberal culture. It didn't matter that Trump himself wasn't demonstrating sort of Christian fruits of the Spirit. He was going to secure power so that Christians who did could restore the nation's virtue, character, and identity. The synecdoche here, I keep thinking about Trump's promise to stop the war on Christmas. It was always framed as a kind of culture wars between two great forces. Religious sociologist Roger Friedland writes that the 2016 election was, quote, a contest between the fist and the lap, the phallus and the womb. For Trump and his followers, a masculine capacity for violence must have priority over a feminine capacity for care of children, of women, of the poor, of the immigrant. If the country can't hit before it hugs, he writes, it risks destroying itself. Now, I'll leave it to my colleague Kristen Dumais and her book, Jesus and John Wayne, to explain the gendered element of this rhetoric. What's important for my purposes is simply to show that Trump did not appeal to evangelical Christians because of a particular policy issue, such as abortion, but because he promised to destroy their cultural and political enemies, including, and maybe especially, government. Many relished his disdain for some of the basic institutions of government because they argued he would roll back the tide of progressive government and repristinate the nation. And let me pause for a minute just to say, I'm not in any way suggesting that I'm describing all people who voted for Trump. I'm sort of digging into both the people I was viewing in the West and then leaders in conversation, in national conversation. So I don't suspect that the Republican Party that backed Trump is homogenous. Now, if you think, as I did initially, that I was only describing the far right, the fringe or the radical fringe of the Republican Party, then I submit you haven't been watching the news. I could give a lot of examples, but just think back to the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. Think back to the images of people carrying flags, crosses, Bibles, and improvised weapons as they stormed the Capitol in an effort to overturn the 2020 election. Think back to, if you saw them, pictures of people gathered in prayer circles before that assault, framing their actions, as Cliven Bundy might say, following the wisdom of God. Now, that was extreme, but I think to understand the mainstream appetite is simply to look at the Republican Party's large silence, or I think deafening silence, about that insurrection over the last month. Other than the small number who condemned it, particularly those who voted to impeach President Trump, Republican leaders have avoided the issue, insisted that the insurrection was peaceful, or even repeated the baseless claim that the insurrectionists were really the FBI or Antifa, who were trying to discredit conservatives. And just 1 week ago, a little behind in my slides. Just 1 week ago, President Trump and Steve Bannon, the former advisor, headlined a rally for Virginia gubernatorial candidate Glenn Youngkin. An American flag that had been carried to the Capitol on January 6th as part of that insurrection was carried out onto the stage with great fanfare so that the crowd could pledge their allegiance to the country using that insurrection symbol. Youngkin later distanced himself from the event, saying that people shouldn't pledge allegiance to that flag and that political violence was wrong. But it isn't easy to dismiss the former president and one of his top advisors and your political base that easily. As I'll explain next week, the bulk of what I attempt to do next week is explain how these more extreme elements of conservative reaction to government became mainstream in American politics. And that brings me back to the title slide that I never explained. This slide shows Holly Fisher, a West Virginia mother of 3, who in 2014 posted this picture of herself with an AR-15 in one hand and a Bible in the other. And she's standing in front of an American flag. The gun and the Bible, she asserted, represent America's founding principles. I'm holding my First and Second Amendment rights in my hands. The nation, as I would read it, she argues, was built on Christian faith or Christian identity, and it was built on violence. And that these, she would not say this directly, certainly, but that these two go hand in hand. Already a prolific right-wing blogger, the controversial image led to a barrage of new media attention and speaking opportunities. She was everywhere in the 2014 midterm election. And today, this particular triad, this sort of gun, Bible, flag triad, is so sort of commonplace on t-shirts, posters, bumper stickers, that it's now also being commodified. So one of the things I saw just last week, or maybe 10 days ago, was this South Carolina Ford dealership that if you buy a new vehicle from them, you will receive a Bible, an American flag, and a voucher to buy an AR-15. So again, I'm looking at this thinking, how did this move from sort of radical fringe to now these 3 symbols and the things they're attached to, like the Capitol insurrection, are now mainstream symbols to be marketed, to be sort of presented proudly as part of one's identity. So this is the sort of reality that I've been trying to understand for the last 7 years. Time and again, I've asked myself the question, is this really happening? Is this South Carolina Ford dealership ad really happening? Or a friend of mine sent me a picture of a billboard in Georgia. It's actually in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. And the billboard was just a picture of Trump, and it said, "Unto us a child is born, and the government shall be upon his shoulders." And I thought, is this really happening? I've asked that question as well when I read that roughly 2/3 of Republicans believe that the 2020 election was stolen, or when I read that vaccine hesitancy differs along party lines. I've asked that when I read that white evangelicals in Pew polls are less likely to get the vaccine than any other religious group. But more importantly, I ask that when I read that white evangelical Protestants are more likely to own guns than any other religious group, and that they are, in fact, more Trump supporters identified as evangelical Protestants in 2020 than in 2016. In other words, there's been, I can't quantify it, but some conversion of people to evangelical Christianity. And we either can say that this is the remarkable work of evangelists, or as I think I can safely interpret it, part of what's happening here is this is merely a part of a cultural, I shouldn't say merely, it is a part of a broader political and cultural identity. So basically, I continue to ask that question. Is this really happening? Every time I see the Bible, guns, and nationalism fused together as a kind of singular political identity, one that I think is fundamentally dangerous for democracy and the Christian church. To say nothing, I would add, to the basic inconsistency of Jesus' message. So that's mainly autobiographical, but I want to pause here and ask if there are any questions so far. We can, have 5-10 minutes. If there are just any basic questions that you'd like me to answer.
Okay, let's see. I don't have anything in the chat. If anybody wants to press the raise hand button or unmute themselves for a minute, you may ask a question. Karen, go ahead.
Thank you. When you think back, it's always easier to look back and see things that we missed at the time.
Sure.
Because it's kind of like that frog experiment in high school where if you drop the frog in boiling water, he's going to jump out. But if you put the frog in while it's cool and turn up the Bunsen burner, he'll actually boil to death. Is anybody worried about this becoming very cultish? I mean, we have to use that word carefully, but I'm talking about the levels where, either everybody kills himself or somebody kills them all, or is this on par or on parallel with that kind of trajectory?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I appreciate that. I certainly can't give a confident answer. The reason I would say no is primarily because the identity is itself a kind of coalition of identities. President Trump has managed in ways both, I think, understandable and inexplicable to sort of lead in front of a kind of, in fact, remake the Republican Party's coalition. But it is, I think that there are enough dimensions of this identity that I don't see it as a kind of, sort of cult, because that would suggest to me that there's something more focused and singular holding that together. I also think, but I do worry that what we're seeing now is, the movement to extremes, particularly in rhetoric, but also in action, where violence is almost inevitable. So I don't see it so much as a kind of cult activity, but where, we are seeing. So for example, right now, the FBI says there have been more domestic terrorism cases that they've investigated in years. So I do think that we're going to see violent outcomes that are associated with this, but that's about the best I can say.
Thank you, James. Judy Parr, you're next. You're muted, Judy.
I was encouraged to learn, it was over a year ago, that the editor of Christianity Today, which has a large audience of evangelical readers, to denounce this kind of Christian nationalism, the kind of hijacking of the Christian faith or evangelicalism by these values of anti-woman, anti-Black, anti-Chinese, and other things. Do you see anywhere that is going, or do you think that his protest and his calling to question what's going on has just become overwhelmed by other things?
Yeah, I don't see that kind of internal call for reform within evangelical circles. I don't see it as something that's really going to move the needle. I think of it more as a kind of internal witness within those communities. And I don't think it will, for a couple of reasons. The first is because if we're talking about a sort of fused identity, right, a sort of religious identity, a political identity, an ethnic identity, it's hard to sort of overcome the inertia of all of those. The second thing I think is that there is so much of a tendency within certain areas of the Christian church, and I'm thinking particularly of sort of evangelical Protestants. There's such a tendency to personalize matters of faith that if you were to personalize questions about immigration, justice, there are plenty of people who evangelicals who are helping immigrants, who are feeding the poor, who are working for justice, but see that as much more of a private obligation. And so when it comes to government, there isn't necessarily the desire to turn the same kind of criticism on government. So I hope I'm wrong, but at the moment I don't see that as likely to gain enormous momentum.
I see that even within some local denominations that you're probably familiar with, that there is often criticism against social justice issues or concerns, and a desire to focus on private faith rather than changing systemic injustice.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
John Klein Hexel, you're next, and then I have one or two in the chat.
Thank you very much. James Skillen, thank you for your presentation so far. I'm curious about your relationship with Representative Meyer, District 3. And of course, we in Holland, Zealand are concerned about the attitude of Representative Huizinga. I was very interested in Karen Tumulty's conversation with Representative Meyer after he returned from his unscheduled visit to Afghanistan. At the very end of her conversation, she asked him a very pointed question. Do you think that the former president is the spokesperson for the Republican Party? Guess what Representative Meyer said? Instead of distancing himself from the former president, he said, I don't know the answer to that. So in a sense, I guess that's an honest answer, but we who are from a Republican background do wonder about the future of the GOP and whether Huizinga and the strong Republican base in his district are going to follow along with this heresy, with this ugly God and country stuff. Do you have any sense of whether Meyer is willing to step aside from Trump's influence?
Well, I don't, so I don't know him personally, and I don't think I have a good answer. What I would say though is that the district he represents, right, is a district that is, by population purple, and he is early indications such as voting for Trump's impeachment, early indications are that, taking a seat from Justin Amash, he is much more in line with, what I would think of as Reagan's Republican Party. And so I do see him in a camp with people like Liz Cheney, who are willing to speak critically when they feel it's necessary. But I also think that doing that does require, in politics, it requires a district that will support that. And I think that his district is probably a challenging one, but it's also not a purely red district. So I consider that a hopeful sign, because, and I want to be clear, I'm not partisan here in terms of certainly not Republican or Democrat, but I do have these concerns about, about the exit of so many, what I would think of as traditional Republicans from Congress just over the last 5 years. Whether it's Paul Ryan, former Speaker of the House, whether it's Justin Amash leaving the Republican Party. There are people, and this will be a sweeping statement, I can try to defend it later, but what I see are really the people who are serious about governing have been leaving en masse and being replaced by people like Lauren Burbett from Colorado, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Even so, Justin Amash and I would disagree. He wanted to abolish the Department of Education. I wasn't for that, but he was serious about governing, about government doing work he thought was appropriate for it. And I think now people who have that mindset are really struggling in Congress right now because it's a hard place to get anything done. And so anyway, sorry, I went off, but the answer to your question is, I don't know, but I certainly don't see Meyer as following the mainstream with Trump. I see him as one of the people who is, the fact that he said he doesn't know. One way to interpret that is to say he wishes it weren't the case, and it is. So, he's kind of holding out hope that Trump isn't the spokesperson, even though it's pretty obvious that Trump is. So thanks.
Thank you. In the chat, James, I have a question. What is fueling media commentators, do you think, to promote this type of message?
Past success. I think that when you look at, and I don't always want to pick on Fox News, but it's the single most successful source. It's also, very mainstream conservative news. Their most popular shows have not been, the main news coverage. The most popular shows have been the Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity, Carlson Tucker, Bill O'Reilly. And these are people who have learned. I'm not going to make any assumptions about what they really believe, but what they've learned is that they gain viewers not by, they gain viewers by looking at the extreme. And that's not just true of conservatives. And I think that the past success of that sort of reinforces the cycle. And I would say, even if you just look at the amount of anti-vaccine coverage on the Fox network, and then compare it to their vaccination rate, because vaccination is required for employees, their vaccination rate is something like 98, 99%. That to me would suggest something about this isn't just belief, this is also just about the business of news.
Very good.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to let Gary Morris ask his question, and then we're going to move on. Go ahead,
Sounds good.
Gary.
Thank you. Now, I certainly recognize that Trumpism and the evangelical leanings toward guns and nationalism are not the same thing. But I think that at least in the last few years, Trump has been a very strong factor. He's under investigation for criminal charges in the state of New York, some of which are felonies. And if he is convicted of a felony before 2024, he's ineligible for federal office. Do you think if Trump were to fade from the scene, either because he's convicted or through some other means, that what you're describing might diminish?
Again, great question. And I'll say the reason why I do history is that I never have to predict anything. But I think yes, and because I do think that there would be more space. So I don't think there'd be some big transformation, because I don't think Trump created what we're seeing. Trump's political genius was recognizing it and exploiting it. But I do think that I don't see any other figures on the horizon that would have sort of Trump's odd mix of political, I'll call it genius. So, if you think of a Ron DeSantis running, or, if I think about, Mike Pence running, I don't see these as people who can actually lead with the kind of charisma Trump has. And what that would allow then is maybe a little more space, not a ton, but a little more space within the Republican Party to, say, run different candidates, to, have some introspection about, is this the direction they want to go? So I think it would be very healthy and create space for the Republican Party. So thanks. All right, well, let me move on. I'll go back to sharing my screen here. I'm going to try again to go full screen. Oops. No, that won't work. So we'll go back to what I did before. All right, so the next, again, I'll do another sort of 20-25 minute block. And now, instead of just sort of explaining how I got interested, I want to explain what I see as at the center of this problem. I'm not suggesting this is the root cause, but as I dig, it's the issue that I keep coming back to, which is the long-standing existence of American civil religion. And I'll explain that in a minute here. And then next week, what I'll do is explain how I think this American civil religion has been radicalized just in the last 40 years. So American civil religion is nothing new. This goes back to the Puritan conviction that America was an exceptional nation, chosen by God as a city set on a hill and a light to the nations. Today's civil religious myth, the conservative myth, is that godly people found North America and prayerfully built a righteous nation. And this myth even includes an Exodus story where Americans were subject to bondage under the British government. But in God's grace, they were given victory over their subjugator. God inspired the US Constitution, providing a guide to prosperity and freedom. And America's prosperity and strength correlates directly with fidelity to God and Judeo-Christian morals. The myth continues, like Israel in the Old Testament, many Americans were tempted by idols of secularism, communism, or liberalism, and chose to return to the bondage that they had experienced before, now under an oppressive government of their own making. The nation languishes in a kind of self-imposed exile. The good news, though, is that redemption is possible. If only Americans would renounce secularism, collectivism, liberalism, and rededicate themselves to the nation's founding principles, they would flourish once again. So listen carefully to the myth as I hear it, that the true nation is defined by a particular Christian identity, but that true Christians are defined by a particular nationalism. Defending the true nation requires maintaining hegemonic Christian culture, a Christian America, and defending the church, defending Christians, requires maintaining hegemonic political power. So it's a self-reinforcing loop from which it's not easy to escape. Now, as I read it, and there are some great people who've written on, the longer history of American civil religion. Mark Knoll is quite good. As I read it, the animating force, though, here is not a constructive piety. It is a profound fear that enemies threaten God's chosen nation. There's a political scientist named Richard Hofstadter, who has a great essay in 1965 entitled "The Paranoid Style in American Politics." And he writes this, it's a long quote. In the paranoid style, the feeling of persecution is central, and it is indeed systematized in grandiose theories of conspiracy. But there is a vital difference between the paranoid spokesman in politics and the clinical paranoiac. The clinical paranoid sees hostile and conspiratorial world in which he feels himself to be living as directed specifically, sees a conspiratorial world in which he feels himself to be living as directed specifically against him, whereas the spokesman of the paranoid style finds it directed against a nation, a culture, a way of life whose fate affects not himself alone, but millions of others. Insofar as he does not usually see himself singled out as the individual victim of personal conspiracy, he is somewhat more rational and much more disinterested. His sense that his political passions are unselfish and patriotic, in fact, go far to intensify his feeling of righteousness and his moral indignation. The paranoid style that he talks about is enduring, but it has certainly narrative changes throughout American history. He goes back and looks at the 19th century and would say, at different points, American, particularly a white Protestant majority, saw the primary threat as coming from Roman Catholics, from Jews, from Mormons, from atheistic communists, etc. I think today, when I read and listen to a lot of conservative news media, so not the actual news, but the kind of talk shows, the threat that I hear articulated over and over again is the threat from secular progressivism, and that would be the sort of religious or moral ideology, and the political ideology would be socialism. Now, Hofstadter's essay is striking to me because he was actually writing at the beginning of what I see as a new phase of paranoid politics. And in a longer talk, I could say a lot about what that is directed at, or sort of the causes for it. But in brief, he was writing in the midst of what is often just called the rights revolution, the progressive rights revolution, which expanded protections for a variety of marginalized groups in the country. African Americans, women, non-Christians, blue-collar workers, even endangered species. This is a period of really remarkable congressional action to remake American society and fundamentally remaking the federal government's role in society. It is important to recognize that those protections came principally through federal action. It was the federal government, after all, that passed and enforced the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that forced school desegregation, that placed limitations on Christian expression in public school, that overturned state bans on abortion, and that created vast new bureaucracies to regulate worker safety and environmental pollution. The progressive rights revolution was then followed by the book that I put up here by Jefferson Decker, The Other Rights Revolution, is interesting. He actually describes how in the 1970s, conservatives really fundamentally or I'd say conservatives built an entirely new political infrastructure to counter the progressive rights revolution. So that rights revolution created a range of enemies, from advocates of unfettered capitalism, who denounced federal regulation, to champions of traditional family values, who denounced the sexual revolution of the 1960s, and who also fought the legalization of abortion. And by the 1970s, these aggrieved parties forged a new, formidable political coalition, backed by an infrastructure of conservative think tanks. So here we are with Ronald Reagan. Conservative think tanks, we would think of new foundations, conservative public interest law firms, Christian ministries. This new right, as it was called, carried Ronald Reagan to the White House and gave Republicans control of the Senate for the first time in 26 years. The new right integrated free market libertarians, brought them into a coalition with religious and social conservatives. The power came in the additive power of coalition building. But of course, this is not a homogeneous group. And so they had to negotiate their differences in order to collaborate. Practically speaking, though, what held them together was a common enemy. It was the federal government, and a common goal, namely pruning the federal government back and restoring some earlier period of American greatness. Think Make America Great Again. Whether that was before the Liberal Rights Revolution, for other people, it was before the New Deal. For yet others, it was before Reconstruction. So going back to the Civil War era. And Reagan's genius at the time, again, Reagan did not create the new coalition. Reagan's genius was seeing it and affirming it and really solidifying it. He was highly effective at engaging evangelical Christians and fundamentalist Christians and bringing them into, for some of them, into voting for the first time. And so as he is managing this diverse coalition, he would focus on this common enemy, the federal government. And he summed this up, including the resentment of the coalition, in his first inaugural address when he told the nation that government was not the solution to the problems, government was the problem. Now, rather than map the whole coalition, I just want to focus on conservative Christians who gave the new right its grassroots power. If you look on this slide, you can see I have just some of the many organizations that formed in the late 70s and early 1980s. Many with conservative Christians who entered the political fight to really try to counteract what they saw as decadence in American culture. Consider, for example, Focus on the Family. James Dobson, who founded it in 1977, aimed primarily to provide parenting education that would counter what he saw as the degenerative social forces of the 1960s, particularly feminism. Another really significant galvanizing event was passage of the Equal Rights Act, which would have prohibited discrimination based on sex. His books, pamphlets, radio programs, and other media reached hundreds of thousands of conservative Christians in the late 1970s. And they, in turn, propelled him into national political debates. He was, when President Carter put together a task force or a committee on the family, Dobson was not initially invited. And President Carter received a list of 50,000 signatures demanding that Dobson be part of that. And he was followed by people like Jerry Falwell, who founded the Moral Majority in 1979. Tim and Beverly LaHaye founded Concerned Women for America, 1979. We also saw emergence of the Family Research Council, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and the Traditional Values Coalition. In a longer talk, I'd kind of talk about how these, the relationship between business interests and family values, particularly kind of free market capitalism. But just it's enough to see that there was this groundswell of evangelicals participating in politics and the formation of a vast new conservative infrastructure that would help hold that coalition together. Now, the very nature of these coalitions means that the groups embrace and advance the interests of their coalition partners. So libertarians, free market capitalists, fiscal conservatives, social conservatives, religious conservatives. Conservative Christians basically baptized many of these ideological commitments, didn't just accept them, but baptized them as fundamentally biblical. So free market capitalism wasn't just a good model, it was the Christian model held over and against atheistic communist Russia. And some of the most influential leaders busied themselves rewriting American history to promote the civil religious mythology of their own conservative coalition. Said another way, they retold the myth of America's founding in ways that more explicitly fused a kind of contemporary Christian faith in God with faith in nation in the United States. In books, movies, pamphlets, and sermons, they treated the United States as a new Israel, God's chosen nation. And God's plan, it turned out, looked eerily similar to the Republican platform. I want to give you just some examples. I'm not suggesting that these were the most influential. They're just really good examples of the kind of media that circulated in the 80s and 90s, sort of building and reinforcing this coalition. So, for example, Christian schools across the country started adopting books like these, written by Peter Marshall and David Manuel. The book on the left, which I used in a Christian high school, an unnamed Christian high school. In fairness, it was in Maryland. We used this in one of our history classes. Here's from the Dust Jacket. Did Columbus believe that God called him west to undiscovered lands? Does American democracy owe its inception to the handful of pilgrims that settled at Plymouth? If indeed there was a specific divine call upon this nation, is it still valid today? The Light and the Glory answers these questions and many more. As readers look at their nation's history from God's point of view, they will begin to have an idea of how much we owe to the very few and how much is still at stake. In high school, I was troubled by this. I've had a few more years to reflect on why it bothered me. Or the book in the middle, From Sea to Shining Sea. The Dust Jacket reads this way. During this 50-year period that the book covers, Daniel Boone, Andrew Jackson, Sam Houston, and other American heroes carved out their place in history. Conestoga wagons and circuit riders became famous. Indian wars and slavery were major concerns. And the Louisiana Purchase and the Oregon Trail expanded America's borders from sea to shining sea. The authors tell how God's hand was evident in these and other key moments in the shaping of a young nation. So a kind of retelling of American history as a nation established by God, guided by God in its formative years. And then later in the current debate saying, but the nation has fallen away from this Eden. And I could say more about the last book as well. The books that you see here were probably not widely read, but what's in them was widely distributed through people like Glenn Beck on his Fox News show from 2009 to 2011. Beck, a devout Mormon, popularized this Mormon scholar, Cleon Skosin, who argued that the US Constitution was nothing less than a divinely inspired document. And you'll find the same narrative in the work of former Republican Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, former Wall Builders founder, David Barton. They're not writing about policy issues. They're not writing about Christian or biblical principles of justice, peace, and political equality. They're writing to tell their readers that America was once a Christian nation. It's been taken over by hostile forces. that their Christian nation was stolen from them and they need to win it back by winning political and cultural power. I'll give just one other example, and this is another case where I asked the question, is this really happening? I was struck recently on Amazon. I'd heard of the Patriot Bible. So I looked at a few different Patriot Bibles. And let me say, I have no problem with a Bible that highlights Christian political responsibility, perhaps bolding passages about giving to Caesar what is Caesar's, just as I have no problem with a green letter Bible that highlights passages about God's care for creation. But these Patriot Bibles do something else. Listen to the description of the one on the left. Actually, I'll just for time, just the one on the right here. The Founders Bible. The new second edition has expanded to include our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights and amendments. Also included is a beautifully illustrated 4-color presentation, front matter section for recording your ancestors. We also include a new article, Freedom is a Fragile Thing, and a revised and updated timeline of American history. What both of these Bibles do is they essentially incorporate American founding documents into the book itself. I don't think they're claiming formally that they are canonizing these texts, but clearly that's part of clinging to the notion that America was a Christian nation and now America needs to be liberated in another revolution. The revolution is generally political, metaphorical, but the idea that we are at an extreme point in American history, whereas the Bundys would say our Constitution and our freedom hangs by a thread. Now, the conservative coalition that I've only briefly described, the New Right, has certainly evolved in the 1980s, but the same sort of civil religion holds it together. When the Tea Party erupted in 2009, the civil religious language was ubiquitous. Tea Party rallies were like revival services where people alternated between prayer and Pledge of Allegiance so often, it wasn't clear which one was more important. At least that's how I saw it. Fox News host, this is Glenn Beck again, because he really was a sort of unofficial spokesperson for the Tea Party in that 2009-2011 period. He would regularly offer tearful eulogies on his show for the Constitution, which he saw as God's blueprint for society. He would weep for America, which he said had been all but destroyed by communist, socialist, fascist, secularist, progressives, thinking of others, basically the left. And he begged Americans to return to God and country and defend them both from attack. And I could go on with example after example. My point is not to criticize any particular moment or expression, but to just highlight briefly a sort of consistent sort of merging of the two, that to protect Christianity, we have to protect America. To protect America, we have to ensure that it has a Christian and white hegemony. But I also want to emphasize that this isn't only on the extreme. This is just woven into our political discourse and our language. I don't know if any of you remember last year when Vice President Pence spoke at the Republican National Convention, and he seemed to conflate Jesus and the American flag. He paraphrased Hebrews 12, just replacing the name Jesus with the American flag. Quote, "So let's run the race marked out before us. Let's fix our eyes on Old Glory and all she represents." And I'd be happy if there are questions about particular parts of this to expand, sort of skimmed over it for time. But where does that leave us? Next week, I'll explain how I think civil religion has led to more extreme rhetoric and action over the last 30 years. In other words, I'm saying this civil religious narrative has been consistent. I'm just starting with the 70s. It goes back further. But I'm saying that narrative is consistent, and yet the Reagan conservative movement did not include militias. It did not include storming the Capitol. It did not include, at that time, the same sort of celebration of guns and celebration of political violence. I don't mean by that random acts of violence, but this kind of repeated celebration of the American Constitution or American Revolution as, the sort of divine work of God and the need for a new political revolution. And I certainly hope that this extreme action peaked on the January 6th insurrection, but from FBI's reporting on domestic terror threats, I certainly don't think that's the case. For now, I would just want to highlight one of the destructive outcomes that is embodied in Trump, and it's the disinterest in the difficult work of governing. Blaming the federal government's expanded role in American society and blaming it for a host of cultural ills. The primary aim of the current Republican Party and the current, I would say, larger conservative movement is about pruning government back to what it was in some earlier period in American history. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for reducing unnecessary and inappropriate government. But the movement's anti-governmental emphasis is not about the sort of, what government should be doing as much as it is to say, there's too much government, we need less of it. And I think that anti-governmental emphasis seems to crowd out a deeper reflection on the biblical and purposes, the constructive purposes of government. The purpose really should not be for, to provide raw power necessary to restore cultural dominance to Christians. The purpose is not to give the church control of the sword. The purpose of government is to do justice for all people. I think in President Trump, conservative Christians found a champion of the former, that is, gaining raw political power to sort of restore a cultural hegemony for conservative Christians, rather than thinking about what is the more difficult work of pursuing justice in a pluralistic society. And the fact that most of the Christians who voted for him in 2016, or I shouldn't say the individuals, but the percentage, was replicated in 2020, suggests to me that many of us as Christians don't understand the latter purpose of government, that we're locked in this problem framing that really is about a kind of culture wars construction of Christian America over and against the forces of the leftist forces of evil. And that's where I think we're locked. But again, next week, what I'll do is explain how I think we've moved from the kind of more optimistic conservatism of Reagan, the idea that government could be reformed, to the sort of truly anti-governmental, I think, constitutional movement today represented in the Capitol insurrection. I'll stop there for today, and we still have some time for questions. So if you want to put those in the chat or ask those, I'd be happy to.
One question, I missed the slide, but someone is asking, there was a slide with a guy holding his face in his hands. Wondered if you know who that is. I missed that one, but.
Holding his face in his
It's the guy with Jesus, and he's holding the Constitution, and there's a guy in the front. Looks like he's in a judicial robe.
Okay. Let's go back here.
While you're looking for that, I just have a couple comments saying thank you so much for this and for tackling this subject. And then kind of an interesting story. We have a member who just returned from a trip to Georgia, and the first billboard noted upon arriving said this: "Every knee will bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord." And in the corner said even Democrats. There you go.
Sure.
Okay. Did you find the slide?
Oh, I did. And I don't know who that figure is.
Okay.
But this is why it's good that I have a chance to come back next week. So that's why you should all return so that we can find out who that person is.
Who the mystery person is. Okay. Great, thanks. I don't have anything else in the chat. So if any, Judy, is your hand raised from before or?
Yeah, I can't. How do you unraise your hand?
I have no idea.
Maybe I'll go back to where I raised it and see what I can do.
Okay.
Click it
Click on
again,
it.
maybe unraise my hand.
Okay, here
Judy?
comes some.
Lower hand, yeah, oh, it's gone.
Oh.
Okay, I learned
Yep.
something today, in addition to all that Jamie has said.
All right, good. Here's a question. It appears that the level of education, i.e. high school graduate, seems to prevail in this group as opposed to college graduates. Also, it appears that the income level is not high in these groups. It seems that these people could gain more economically under the Democrats than Republicans.
Well, I do think, one of the just fundamental truths is that we're all inconsistent. There's always a gap between our kind of professed beliefs and what we do, or even tension among our professed beliefs. So I think one of the interesting things I've been watching is the degree to which at least the Biden administration infrastructure bill has been overwhelmingly popular, the bipartisan support, even in really conservative districts. So people aren't necessarily against, people want government investment in infrastructure, and there is an inconsistency between that and a kind of denunciation of government itself. So I think there is a fair amount of that goes on, where even if you are yourself being helped by a government program, you might even appreciate that program while still maintaining a kind of more principled stance against government. The other demographic variables are really fascinating. I mean, when you look at a political map, a lot of political scientists who are mapping, demographers as well, our political map is now really, it is a sort of geographic divide in American politics. If you look at the state of Michigan and you look at the 2020 election or the 2016 election, the color is almost perfectly correlated with population density. So if you live in a high density area, you are likely in a blue voting or at least purple voting. And as that population density subsides, you're going to see it shift to red. And so this is why, President Trump would always show a map of the United States showing how much of it he had won by area. He won most of the United States. It's just that most of the people happen to live in large urban areas. We're about 80% urban. And so it's worth, those kinds of variables that you kind of wonder, what is it that drives that? And I won't try to answer that question. The education, I think, is also really interesting, partly because my job depends on higher education. So I have a vested interest. But, I think we are seeing in culture right now a few things, a few sort of critiques. One is the critique, totally valid, whether or not higher education is worth the price, right? It's extremely expensive. But I think a sort of pretty consistent effort in many, I'll say far right circles, but certain conservative circles to discredit universities and research experts. So we're seeing that now with the coronavirus vaccine. There is this sort of deep distrust of expertise. And, I don't know sort of the relationship between that and the question here about voting patterns in education. But certainly that's part of how this battle is being constructed as Trump won by mobilizing on a populist platform. That Trump, I mean, this is the irony here, is that Trump was running against elitists, is what he said, right? So he ran the populist platform, but he was going to help people no longer have to answer to, people with PhDs or, liberals. I'll give one other example of this, which is Ammon Bundy, who's now running for governor in Idaho. I don't think he'll win, but his platform's interesting because there's the standard libertarian move of we're going to cut programs, lower taxes, but he also promises that if elected governor, he will end all licensure in the state of Idaho, including, so that would mean there would be no licensure for doctors, nurses, lawyers, plumbers, electricians, because that's government interference in the market. It's elitist. So he says people should just all be able to go into the marketplace, decide who they want to trust for their doctor. And then I guess if enough of them die, the market will say, this isn't a good doctor, don't go to them. But that kind of anti-elitism is, I think, really powerful right now.
Okay. The next question is that there has been a decline in church membership at the same time that this civil religious movement has been rising. Do you think there is a correlation here?
That's a great question. I don't necessarily see, I have no authority on this, but my guess is there is not a strong correlation. And the reason I say that is looking at the way conservative churches have, sort of rallied around, not all conservative churches, but a significant number have rallied around Trump, have rallied, let's say, anti-vaccine. And I think the reason, as I hinted at earlier, is within much of the political thought that I read within evangelical Christianity, there is a privatizing of Christian faith that really is about you and Jesus. It's about your soul. And so there isn't really within that framing of Christianity very much to work with when it comes to thinking Christianly about politics. So I think that the other factors like, stagnation of wages, a generation that isn't going to have materially be better off than their parents, some of the kind of hot button social issues, I think those are much more significant than whether or not there is an active church attendance or church membership.
Thank you. I think the last one I have is, how do you see fear being used perhaps by both sides?
Yeah, unfortunately, fear is maybe the most powerful motivator. It's also not a motivator that leads to our best decisions. No organism, human or otherwise, makes its best decisions in a stress state. And I would say that, and if you're thinking about currency, whether it's political power or in media money, you're going to use the tool that generates the most of it. And so I think that this fear, for conservatives, the fear really is, I should say, on the conservative side, for many people, the fear is that our country is gone, or our country is on the brink, that our children are going to live in a country that, denounces God, destroys the family, becomes increasingly socialist. And it's a sense that we are kind of living on the brink of a catastrophe. Next week, I'll say a little bit more about, the role of social media in this, because one of the differences over the last 40 years is how mainstream conspiracy theories are. What would have formerly been truly fringe theories about, let's say, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Administration, the conspiracy theory that FEMA is building internment and death camps around the country, so that dissidents can be taken there and taken out of American politics. Well, in the 70s, that conspiracy was around, but that conspiracy was largely fringe militia groups, say in the mountains of Idaho. And now that conspiracy is sort of trading in the mainstream. And I think that is critically important because, as I think about it, if I really believed that a government agent was going to come to my house, steal my children, forcefully vaccinate them, remove them to a camp in the middle of the US, I would be acting very differently too, right? I wouldn't be here giving this talk. I would be preparing somewhere. So I think that's powerful. I think on the left, there certainly is no shortage of fear. And I just don't know that I could articulate in the same way, because it's not what I study, what the principal fears are that are being mobilized. If I were to guess, one of them is, this notion that we are, that so many sort of new rights or so many improvements in the quality of life for marginalized people, there have been gains. And the fear is, rather than continuing to move forward, we're going to move back. And I think that is a powerful fear. One thing I'll say at the very end is, I mentioned earlier the idea of an exodus narrative within this American civil religion. And that's the narrative that, Americans were the Israelites under British oppression. God parted the Red Sea through the American Revolution, and, we went to the Promised Land. And that Exodus narrative then frames freedom. It frames the Promised Land as freedom from government. So enjoying the Promised Land means you no longer have the government looking over your back. But if you think back to, 1790s, 19th century, that freedom was enjoyed by a very narrow demographic. I mean, to be fully enjoyed, you were white, landowning, and male. There is, I think, on the left, an alternate Exodus narrative, and also a very powerful one. That's the one where you think particularly of African Americans who were enslaved in the United States. So they're literally enslaved. Their exodus from slavery actually comes through the federal government. So the federal government is the one that parts the Red Sea, and they're just now marching toward the Promised Land. So for them, the Constitution is something yet to be realized in this narrative. But it's important to see that government is not King George. Government is not the oppressor. Government is Moses. And that leads to just fundamentally different ways or different starting places for thinking about the potential good that government can do.
Thank you. All right, it is 2:30. Judy, would you like to wrap us up?
I think you've given us a lot of material to think about, James. I really appreciate everything that you had to say. And I think, just a brief note, I think that there are left fears too. And I think I'm reading more recently that the left is fearing a demise of our democracy by attempts to discredit voting. Might want to touch on that next time a bit. Look forward to next time. Come back next week, everybody, and hear some more really exhilarating and challenging thoughts.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Enjoy the afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, try to get outside before it rains.
Yes.
All right.
Thanks.